We actually abandoned about 18 months of code. We just deleted it basically. And we started over, and we came across where we thought up, partly being influenced by some stuff in the literature, but we also introduced a lot of our own ideas to what we call a modified cut-cell Cartesian approach, right? And that is the core of the autonomous meshing in Converge.
But like 18 months of code, what was that decision like? Like that, as a young company, I feel like that must have been a difficult
It was
decision.
extremely difficult. Yeah.
Today I'll be talking with Kelly Senecal, a co-founder of Convergent Science. A special thanks to Convergent Science for sponsoring this episode. Kelly received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is currently an adjunct professor. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Oxford and a co-founder and director of the Computational Chemistry Consortium. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss an episode. Kelly, thank you for joining the show today. I'm really stoked to talk with you.
Thanks, Cade. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So can you give our listeners, many people know you, well known in CFD, but a brief introduction, who you are, what you've done, and where you're at?
Yeah, no problem. So my name's Kelly Senecal. I'm one of the co-founders and owners of a company called Convergent Science, and we are located in Madison, Wisconsin, which is where we also did our graduate studies way back in the day, and that's where the founders met, and we decided to start a company, and maybe we'll talk more about that later. But we develop and sell and support the Converge CFD software package, which hopefully most of the listeners or many of the listeners have heard of. And if you haven't, you'll learn more about it today. So that's sort of my main job, my day job. I'm involved in a lot of other activities, professional societies. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Oxford. So I have my hand in a lot of different pots. But yeah, my main job is helping run the business of Convergent Science.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm excited to dive into this more. And one of the questions I'm always interested in, and you touched on it, that you got started in CFD as colleagues, like the founders, right, in school. So can you tell us more about that? What was your first experience with simulation?
Well, my first experience with simulation actually goes a little further back. So I was a physics undergrad major, and I was going to stay on campus between my junior and senior year and do a research project. And I was at a small liberal arts school. There wasn't a lot of research like you might find at one of these, bigger R1 schools. But I was working on finite element analysis, and I was asked to do some by hand and write some code to solve some pretty simple physics problems, simple compared to solving the Navier-Stokes equations, pretty simple physics problems using finite element analysis. And I want to pretend I remember it vividly, but it was a long time ago, but kind of. I mean, my advisor at the time, Professor Cook, he walked into the physics laboratory, the computational physics laboratory, and I think he was holding a CD. Or something like that, some sort of old storage media. And it said FIDAP on it. And he's like, have you ever heard of something called CFD? And I said, no. I mean, I was a physics major too, so that wasn't really, we didn't even have a formal course in fluid dynamics. He said, you can solve a lot of the problems you're doing by hand and in more dimensions. And it uses finite element. FIDAP actually solved the equations using finite element analysis. Some of your listeners may be familiar with FIDAP. And my mind was kind of blown, to be honest. I was like, holy cow. And I was doing really simple things like pipe flow with immiscible fluids and kind of looking at the interface between two immiscible fluids and the stability and solving the Orr-Sommerfeld equation and things like that, but then also simulating that using FIDAP. And I fell in love. And I asked my advisor, I said, okay, who does CFD in grad school? And he said, well, not usually physics departments. I mean, it could be, but typically it's like applied math or mechanical engineering or aerospace engineering. I said, okay, that's what I'm doing. So I knew I wanted to do CFD in graduate school. I didn't really care at the time what the application was.
Yeah.
We can talk more about the application, but I just wanted to do CFD. And that's what led me to the University of Wisconsin-Madison doing CFD actually on internal combustion engines.
Awesome. That is such a neat story. So I feel like this just segues perfectly into where I'm really interested. And I know our listeners, they want to hear the story of how did convergent science come about? And it sounds like the roots are really, the seeds are getting planted with University of Wisconsin-Madison. So is
Yeah.
that, just continue on, I guess. So how did it go and how
Yeah,
did
yeah, no,
convergent
yeah.
science
So
start?
that, yeah, for sure. So that's where we met. We were lab mates at the UW Madison in the Engine Research Center, and we were doing CFD. There was
Okay.
an experimental component to that research group, as you might imagine, and there was a computational component, and we worked pretty hand in hand. Running. They'd run experiments, we'd validate, and things like that with the CFD. Um, we were kind of looking ahead. Pretty we were kind of mid-career graduate students, if you want to call it that, and we were kind of looking ahead to like what the next step might be in a couple of years. And we wanted to stay in Madison. Madison, I don't know if you've been to Madison. It's a beautiful
I
place.
haven't.
It's a great college town, really cool atmosphere and culture and stuff like that. But especially at that time, there was no convergent science. There was really nowhere for us to work, right? Typically, we were doing a lot of work on IC engines, so we would maybe go to the Detroit area, work with the auto companies, or work for one of the big heavy duty companies. But we wanted to stay in Madison, so we had this crazy idea: let's start a company. And so we formed it while in graduate school. We didn't really do much because, as you know, graduate school alone is a full-time job and more, right? But we wanted to have something sort of prepared for when we graduate. So the idea was, as people graduate and get their PhDs, they would be like the first person to do that. They would be the first person to go full-time in the company, and then people would follow, right? Well, some people got cold feet and or just decided maybe it wasn't for them, and they went and got jobs. And so it was down to three of us, right? Myself, Keith, and Eric. And I was actually the first person to go full time. But we originally were a consulting company, right? We weren't a software vendor. So we had become very experienced with a code called Kiva. It was a government code out of Los Alamos National Lab originally. It was open source in the sense that people got the source code. I don't know if it would truly fit the open source model, but a lot of the auto industry was using it. And we became very good at running analyses and running CFD simulations with Kiva. It was very difficult to make meshes in Kiva, very difficult for anything that was at all complicated. And so we developed a tool called GSmooth that allowed us to make Kiva meshes. It still took a few days up to a couple of weeks, but that was very fast compared to like what else was out there. So most of our early consulting work was based around making meshes. And then if we were asked to do analysis projects, we would still be spending a lot of time making meshes because you had to make a mesh first before you could do your analysis, right? So that's kind of where we started out of graduate school, is a consulting company doing CFD work and a lot of meshing.
Yeah. So and you've mentioned in the stuff I was doing reading, preparing for this, you mentioned that you spent a lot of time preparing. So how did that evolution come about, right? And I think this may have been, I think Tony Hurt, so he was also from Los Alamos, started Flow3D, and he has a statement that he said he learned very quickly it was hard to do consulting because you either have too much work and not enough workers, or or it's the opposite. You have not enough work and too many workers. And he also pivoted to selling a software. And so did that evolution and realization come about for you of, you know what, maybe we should just tackle this meshing problem? Or how did you steer yourself more in that direction?
Yeah, that's a really good question, a really complicated one, but let me try to
Yeah.
tell that story in a kind of a brief way. Yeah, we were spending all of our time making meshes, and we came to the realization that, you know, we don't want to, or we can't or don't want to sustain a company that's built around making meshes, right? That's not really, if you ask me what is my dream, it's not. And no offense to people who, I actually really enjoyed making meshes back in the day. It was very, once you finished it, because it was difficult to do, once you finished it, it felt really good. It's like, okay, I've made my mesh. Then just don't ask me to make another one for a few months.
Right.
But we originally had this idea of like, what is the big bottleneck in doing these engine simulations and CFD in general? It's often making the mesh, especially at that time. At that time, the meshing was the big bottleneck. So we had this crazy idea to write our own software package originally, and this is a fun fact for your listeners. Originally, the software was actually called Moses, which stood for Modular Open Source Engine Simulation. Right. And so at the time this was going to be an open source package. And what happened is we were confident and cocky enough, maybe, as a lot of fresh PhDs are. We wrote an unsolicited proposal to the DOE and said, you didn't ask for this, but we know you want it. Yeah. And they were like, oh, this is really interesting. We're not going to fund this now, but come back to us if industry is excited about it. Then we'll rethink it or whatever. And we went to industry and never looked back at that point. Well, I shouldn't say that. We work closely with the DOE on projects, but we went to a company called Caterpillar, which I'm sure you've heard of. And it's no secret that they were involved in the early stages of Moses, which eventually became Converge. And they provided us with a little bit of funding. And then there was a lot of sweat equity. And we were, doing consulting by day, writing code by night. But the whole premise of writing that was, we don't want to make meshes anymore. Engineers want to do the analysis, and the meshing is just sort of an ends to the means. It's not like where you want to be spending all of your time. Originally when we started writing Moses, which eventually became Converge, we eventually decided, let's make this a commercial code. This automated meshing idea that we had. Well, first of all, we took a path down the immerse boundary direction. And we spent a year and a half implementing an immerse boundary method, which actually worked pretty well unless you needed conservation. And so for very complex geometries with moving boundaries and stuff that happens in an engine, it was very difficult to get it to conserve. It looked pretty, but it's very difficult to get it to conserve. So we actually abandoned about 18 months of code. We just deleted it, basically, more or less. And we started over, and we came across where we thought up, partly being influenced by some stuff in the literature, but we also introduced a lot of our own ideas to what we call a modified Cutsil-Cartesian approach, right? And that is the core of the autonomous meshing in Converge. That, coupled with adaptive mesh refinement, really allows, efficient usage of cells. You can still resolve, where it needs the cells without having to resolve your entire domain. So put those two things together, and it was really, at the time, it was a big breakthrough. And so much so that when we would go to talk to customers about it, they wouldn't believe us, right? They've seen the marketing before from all these companies. They're like, yeah, whatever, automated meshing. And so, yeah, that was a little bit of an uphill battle at first. But yeah, we got there.
So I want to unpack a couple things. First off, thank you. It's so exciting to hear about and to kind of relive this with you. But 18 months of code, what was that decision like? Like that, as a young company, I feel like that must have been a difficult
It was
decision.
extremely difficult. Yeah, because at the time it was just three of us, and then at that time it was just the three of us, Keith, Eric, and myself. Actually, that's not totally true. We had another partner named Dave Schmidt. So shout out to Dave Schmidt, who was a partner, but his lifelong dream was to become a professor. Okay. So he's now a professor at UMass Amherst, but he was working with us too. And then he eventually was kind of doing both. And then he decided, if I'm going to be a professor, I just need to be a professor. So I say three of us, but there was a fourth person in there.
Yeah.
At one point as well. So I definitely want to give him credit as well.
Sure.
But yeah, it's one of those things where, and you find this in research a lot, where you spend so much time on something, you want to believe it's right and you want to hang on to it. And it's hard to say, that's wrong. I was wrong. That method, going down that path, and not to like bag on immerse boundary method. I think it's very useful for a lot of things. And I think people have had a lot of success with it, but for what we were trying to do, right. And ultimately to be a commercial code and to be very robust code for engines where conservation is critical and stuff like that, it just wasn't the right path for us. And so, yeah, we sat around a table. I'm a little bit making this up because this is how I imagine it probably happened. But I think we sat around a table and just were like, I think it was around lunch. Honestly, I think it was around lunch. And we said, you know what? This is going to be one of the hardest things we have to do, but we just need to start over. And the sooner we start over, the better.
Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, we could have hung on to that, probably tried to patch it, make it work, try to get by with it or whatever. And that would have just prolonged the issue. So when you're a startup company, you hear about like fail early, fail often, that kind of stuff. Well, we failed early, and I like to think we haven't failed often, but we failed early. And that was a good thing to do. Looking back, I think it was good that happened. That taught us a lot about when is it time to give up on something because it's just not the right way to go. And so, yeah, it was very difficult, but we did it. And in the end, it worked out well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really those lessons that you take away, where textbooks don't give you the answer to those decisions, right?
Right.
Like as
Right.
engineers, it can be difficult. So thank you for unpacking that for us. So,
Sure.
um, and again, I do want to touch on this. Like in today's world, because of Converge, and I feel like largely because of that knowing that there's someone out there where it is automated meshing, like that feels so much less radical. And can you just touch on, and you did, like people wouldn't believe you, but what did you have to do to punch into the market with
Yeah.
that like novelty? Like one, there's already a stigma around technical sales, right? And we could probably
Mhm.
spend a whole podcast on that. But then the incumbents, right? So there's other players in the market that are already there. And then you have this additional novelty of like automated meshing. So what was that like breaking into the market? Can you give some examples of how that happened?
Yeah, no, I've got a lot of stories there. How much time do you have? Yeah, so it was not easy, and there are a lot of things that go into that. One thing that goes into that is we started developing Moses, which became Converge, in around 2001, 2002.
Okay.
It's kind of when we wrote the first lines of code. 2008 was when we felt like we're going to market with this. Okay. Now, looking back, it's like, what were we doing? Because 2008, the automotive industry, which was our big customer base, crashed, right? I don't know if
Yeah.
you remember, the listeners remember. I mean, that was a while ago now, but it was a bad time, a rough time for the automotive industry. So it actually became sort of a blessing in disguise, though, because they were looking for something more efficient. At the end of the day, it was like, I mean, getting someone in the automotive industry to agree to buy new software was really hard, extremely hard. But like, oh, this is more efficient. Okay, maybe that does make sense for what we need right now. But yeah, people wouldn't believe us. So the way we had a lot of contacts in the industry from our graduate school days and from going to conferences. And I can't stress enough for like young graduate students or early career engineers, networking, going to conferences, and building up sort of those building up that network, right, is it's hard to put a value on that. It's priceless. And so we had a lot of people that were like, this sounds crazy, but I've actually seen their work in other areas, and I think I probably should listen to what they have to say. So what we would do is we would go on site and we would say, give us your hardest geometry. We've never seen it before. Bring it on a thumb drive, an STL file or whatever, triangulated surface, and bring it to us. And we'd have it running in about 5-10 minutes. Okay, that's what it took. It took us doing it in front of them on their own geometry, right? Because when you start showing examples of things, you never know what went into it and blah blah blah. I shouldn't bag on marketing because I lead marketing at Convergent Science, but there's always some marketing spin to things or whatever.
Sure.
We don't do that, of course. But like if you show somebody right in front of them, it's like there's nothing more powerful,
Yeah.
right? And so that's how we got in. The other thing that was really challenging was we were 3 people. In 2008, we were actually 5 people. We brought Dan Lee, who heads our sales and is also a co-owner of the company. He was an original founder. He had gone to ANSYS. Hopefully he's okay with me telling this story. He'd gone to ANSYS and started as a support engineer and then became a salesperson, became a really good salesperson. 2008, we were looking to sell our software. Ansys had bought Fluent. So he had actually gone to Fluent originally. We
Okay.
brought him back in. He wanted something different because, he loved Fluent, but wasn't sure about Ansys or whatever. And perfect timing,
Yeah.
right? So, but we had him back in the company, and now we're starting to get these benchmarks lined up with these big companies, whether they're automotive or heavy duty companies, and people who made engines basically at the time. And we would do benchmarks with all the big players. You can imagine who they were, right? And here we are. I think we had 5 people because I think we'd hired our first employee at that point too. So we were 5 guys, and we would go through these benchmarks, and they were pretty upfront with us. They said, we have these 5 or 6 categories we're rating all the software on. One of them is like accuracy of solution. One is knowledge of the people at the company, right? So we can count on them to give us good support. Blah 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 down the line. And then one of the categories was size of the company. So we would knock all the categories out of the park. We would typically win on all the other categories, except for size of the company. And we were so low on size of the company, and people were worried, like, is this company going to be around in a few years? Should we invest in their software? We don't know what's going to happen. Okay. A couple of the benchmarks, we still won a lot of benchmarks. A couple of them we lost because of the size of the company. And it's funny because I was personally really involved in one of these benchmarks. I was running all of the cases. I was giving all the support. And I was pretty down on losing one of these. And my partners, something I give Keith and Eric credit for, they're always optimistic in that. They were like, you know what? Eric especially. Eric was like, they're going to come back. And I was just like, oh, I just spent 6 months, doing this painful benchmark. They're going to come back. And lo and behold, in about 6 months, I mean, probably not 6 months, but something like that, they came back and said, you know what? We were wrong. We want to use your software. And by getting enough of those companies doing that, we quickly started growing. And not that we're anywhere near the size of some of our competitors, but we got to the point where they're like, okay, we're comfortable with giving, writing big checks to this company, essentially.
So a couple clarifications, just maybe for listeners and for me as well. When you talk heavy industry companies, you're talking like heavy equipment, like your construction equipment, large engine. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. On-road and off-road.
Yeah.
Right. So trucking.
Yeah.
Plus like off-roaded construction and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like what you'd see Caterpillar on the side of at a construction site doing, and then
exactly
hauling stuff, Kenworth, Peterbilt. So the other thing I just want to draw attention to here it's also become more apparent. I didn't realize, this is, correct me on timing here. So 2001, you start writing code. You're still under 5 employees 7 years later. And I just point this out that I think when people think that they want to start a company, they forget how much sweat equity goes into it, right? Like someone takes Convergent Science now and says, "Oh, what, you're 200 plus now?"
Around 200, 180, okay. Something
around
like that. Yeah,
200 employees, and they think, "Oh, wow, it's been linear, like just this happy." And not that it's not rewarding, but I just want to clarify for people, like, the timeline of how this stuff happens. It's not a walk in the park.
No, it's not a walk in the park. And yeah, I mean, exactly. So we were doing consulting to pay the bills.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we were writing
code by night, right? Like,
yeah. And I remember, I'll tell a funny story now, because if Keith ever listens to this, he loves it when I tell this story. But when Keith and Eric and I, we were the only 3 people writing the software, for many years. And we weren't using Git or anything like that. Our Git was, hey, Keith, where's the latest folder with the source code? Oh, it's over here. Okay, I'll add my stuff. And when there's 3 of you, you can kind of get away with that. Now, I still wouldn't recommend that with the tools we have today.
Sure.
But at the time, it was okay. So we literally, there was a month in there where we had to have a certain release done by a certain day. And we pretty much lived in the office. We rarely went home. And this isn't a sob story. This is actually something that sometimes you just have to do if you want to be successful. Not that I would recommend not going home, but one day, so I was like, Keith, I was implementing the spray models, right? The multi-phase spray models, the Lagrangian spray models into the code. And I said, Keith, where's the latest code? Okay. And Keith's like, yeah, I'm going home. We're like, okay, all right, we'll see you in the morning. And so Eric and I were still there all night, and I grabbed the code and I'm merging in all my stuff. And because I was working on like a slightly older version, I was merging it into the latest version, and my spray penetration was just wrong. And it was like, what is going on? I was beating my head, and I had Eric come over, and I'm like, Eric, you got to help me figure this out. Sometimes fresh eyes are needed, right? Because I've been staring at the same code for hours, and he's looking at it. We cannot figure it out. Like, the spray models look like they're perfect. I mean, within reason, but implemented the way we wanted, right?
Yeah.
we eventually figure out that Keith had hard-coded the viscosity because he was testing something completely unrelated, and he forgot to change it back before he gave us the code. And so it was like super high viscosity, and so like it was like shooting spray into molasses basically. He came in the next morning all chipper, right? Because he had gotten a good night's sleep that night, and I was just like, Keith, you owe me so much for this. So I love telling that story. It's funny because it really speaks to sort of yes, make use of all of the tools that are available, and you can avoid things like that. But also just when you're starting up, that felt like every little thing like that can feel really big, right? And so the main thing, the advice I give to people starting a company is you have to be okay. There's going to be a lot of bumps along the road, but hopefully there's also going to be a lot of highs along the road, highs and lows. As long as overall you can draw an average through that curve and you're kind of trending upward, even if it's small, right? Stick with it because, there are a lot of things like that come up that feel like big setbacks at the time, like losing the benchmark originally and things like that. But stick with it. And that's why a lot of companies don't succeed too, because things come up and they're like, I'm out of here. My life could be so much easier, right? If I just go work for somebody, and that's fine. That's totally great. But if you truly want to start a company, you have to be okay with the bumps along the road.
Yeah. Awesome story. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. So as you look at breaking into new markets and industries, it's been said that and there's a lot of books about this, right? Crossing the Chasm or other, maybe some technical marketing stuff, but you've got to have one focus. And so it looked like, and this is again from the outside in and what I've read, you guys decided automated meshing is one of our unique differentiators. Obviously, I don't want to discount the domain expertise you have with Combustion and what you'd been doing and consulting that was informing your decisions along the way, I assume as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Your day job was still was helping you write better code, and it's really some people might call it cheating, right? But that's just the way you do it. You learn and figure stuff out like that. So the question though is how did that change and frame your decisions running the company, right? When you decide, okay, we're going to remove this really tedious process of meshing, did that make a lot of decisions easier from there on out, that you have this laser focus on removing meshing? Because I think one of the things that personally, so with the business I've started, there's so many things you can do. That how do you prioritize? And so unless you pick one thing, to say no to other things feels hard, but you just have to be committed. So if you can speak to that level of commitment of this is our laser focus and what we're going to do.
That's an excellent question. And that's another good piece of advice for people starting up companies and things like that, is knowing when to say no to things is very powerful, right? Because you can't do everything. You want to do everything. And trust me, I want to do everything. But if you try to do everything, you're not going to do any of it extremely well. Probably, maybe, right? And so our laser focus was, of course, the autonomous meshing, complicated geometries, moving boundaries. However, in terms of the market, we were very focused because it was our background and because we had the domain expertise. And really, we could sit in a room with anybody and it was pretty clear. I mean, not to toot our own horns, but it was pretty clear we really were experts on this topic. And that was the internal combustion engine stuff, right? And so it played really nicely because we had the domain expertise there, but it's also a really hard problem, right? Because of the moving valves and piston and complicated geometries, multi-phase, turbulent flow, reacting flow. It kind of has not everything, but it has a lot of the things that make CFD hard. Are in there, which actually later created a very good foundation for us to kind of move into other things. But yeah, exactly. So the goal kind of was, let's write the code from the beginning to be general. There are a lot of decisions we had to make where we could do it this way, and then it would be maybe a little easier for IC engine people to set up a problem or something, talking about input structure and stuff like that. But if we do that, that makes it feel too much like an IC engine code. We were always looking down the road. Eventually we want to compete with ANSYS and Star and all of these people, right?
Yeah.
And so our goal was let's own the engine market, and that took a long time and was not easy. And the sales cycle for these things is very long. Let's own that market, and then once we own that market, we'll be in a stable position where we can now devote resources to ramping up in other markets as well. You see what I mean? So it's like, let's laser focus on the IC engine stuff to get us to a place where, we have a stable revenue stream and we're successful and we can hire lots of people and stuff like that. And then now over the last, probably 5-6 years, something like that, we've really started to branch out in a lot of different areas. And what was nice about that too is because, if our initial market was pipe flow, not that that would be our initial market, but if our initial market was pipe flow, we would have been really focused on pipe flow, and then maybe it'd be much harder to go from pipe flow to engines. Well, going from engines to pipe flow is easier, if that makes sense. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, there are really complicated problems that we're trying to look at now. Like we're doing rockets and biomedical and things like that have huge challenges, in some ways harder than IC engines, some ways easier, but very difficult problems. Yeah. But we're used to that. We sort of say we solve the hard problems. In fact, we've used that as a slogan off and on. If you're doing pipe flow, you're not really going to see the benefits in Converge over other software. But if you're doing something really complicated in terms of geometry and moving boundaries, fluid structure interaction, things like that, you'll start to see the value pretty quickly. And so that's where we kind of shine, is in the hard problems.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the things as you were talking earlier. Literally, I was going through my mind. I was like all the advice of learning CFD, at least, is like start simple, start stuff. And so when you start listing off like moving boundaries, so that's not exactly simple. No. Reacting flow, turbulence, like it gets, it's but in the same sense too, that's also, you talk about this idea of building a moat around your business. If you build a business, you want to make it hard to replicate, right? You're going to put sweat equity into it. And so that's created a nice moat for you to have to then branch out on, right?
And what's really interesting is, back when we were trying to break into these companies, it was so frustrating to me that if you're the incumbent code, you probably know this, but if you're the incumbent code at a company, especially a large company, it's really hard to displace that. You can't just be 5% better. You can't just be 10% better. They have a whole workflow built around this code, right? You have to be a lot better, right? Yeah. And so we obviously we proved that we're a lot better in a lot of these areas and for a lot of these companies. But now that we're the incumbent, now I love it. It's like, we're not that we're set. We have to continue to. Sure. We're constantly, trying to ask our customers, what can we do next? What do you need? Where are you going? And we know that we're not safe forever or whatever. I mean, other codes are going to keep getting better as well. New people, like when we started, they're going to come up. And so we definitely don't, sit on our hands or anything like that. But it is kind of nice being the incumbent code sometimes.
Yeah. There's a reward commensurate with what it took to get there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good way to say it. Yep.
If anyone's interested in this discussion, going deeper, I think the book Crossing the Chasm talks so much about the whole product solution and what it really takes to. Anyway, it's a great reading and looking at it from a CFD code perspective. If you go through, so man, this has been so good. So pivoting on to growth, international expansion. When did you expand internationally? What was that like? What made that expansion possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because international expansion has actually been huge for us. Obviously we continue to grow in the US, but if we really want to grow to where we want to go, it has to be a global sort of thing. A lot of these companies are multinational, right? So there's need for support kind of in other, it's not just in the US, right? But it's all over the world. And so a couple of things happened. We had a user from the U.S. He actually worked at Southwest Research Institute, but he was from Austria originally, and he really wanted to go back to Austria. And he said, hey, how about I be a distributor for your software? I already know it now because I've used it as a customer, and I kind of want to start my own thing. How about I go be a distributor in Austria and distribute throughout Europe? And after kind of talking a lot and planning and stuff, we're like, okay, let's do it. We'll take a chance on you.
Yeah.
That worked out so well that we ended up essentially buying, merging, whatever you want to call it, that company. Yeah. And that's now Convergent Science GmbH, which is headquartered in Linz, Austria. And so that serves Europe. And as you can imagine, especially when we were only really focusing on IC engines, right? The growth potential in Europe is huge, right? You have all the auto companies, you have Formula One, there's a lot of stuff there. There's the heavy duty marine, there's trucking there as well. There's a lot of growth opportunity there, and we grew significantly in Europe. The other one was Asia. Now, in around 2014, I think it was around the time when we also merged with our distributor in Europe. There's a company called IDAJ. They used to be CDAJ. Okay. Maybe you've heard of them. They used to distribute Star CD.
Okay.
So we had a different, and there's another message here where, like, if you're going to work with distributors, getting the right distributor is extremely important, right? So we had a distributor in Japan before IDAJ. It just wasn't really working out. Okay. For different reasons. People would always say to us, why don't you use IDAJ? We was like, well, we'd love to, but they distribute our competitor. How's that going to work? Right. And so it was kind of a really nice collection of things that happened for our benefit in the end that made IDAJ available to distribute Converge. And so that relationship has been huge for us. And again, as you can imagine, lots of auto companies in Japan, China, South Korea, lots of automotive stuff going on there. And so our growth through IDAJ has also been really big, and we have a great relationship with them. We've now had them as a distributor for many years, and we're going to keep moving with them, keep moving forward with them. And as we move into a lot of new areas as well, they're motivated to sell into these new markets as well as our European. We also, by the way, have our own office in Pune, India, and there it became apparent that for these multinational companies, they really wanted to have some local support, but also there's a lot of organic stuff in India as well, right? India's got a lot of really great stuff happening there, technology-wise. And so our Indian office kind of serves both purposes, right? It's trying to grow in sort of Indian companies, but also we have people that maybe support our multinational customers that have facilities in India. So that's been also really big for us. So that's kind of how we've grown globally. Is we have a few offices here in the U.S. We have the Austrian office with salespeople distributed like in the UK and Italy as well, and things like that. And then we have our Indian office, and then we have our distributor for Japan, China, and South Korea. So put that all together, it's been great.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really neat, and especially, as you talk about it, I hadn't thought through the customer base of who would use Converge, right, and where they're located. Like Asia makes a ton of sense. Yeah. So anyway, it's just interesting. I'm a little slow to connect the dots sometimes.
No, that's fine.
It's cool.
There are a lot of dots, so sometimes it's hard to connect them.
That's right. So a couple questions that in announcing this podcast, I sourced some questions from LinkedIn, and one of these questions, I don't know that we'll get time for all of them, but we've touched on a few of them too, but I'm just going to read this one. It says, can you share your view of how important the CFD tools evolution is to enable the eclectic combination of technologies in engine designs? And what are the main challenges ahead that require such tool evolution? And before you answer, I should apologize for not having a virtual engine that you can hug.
Oh, yeah, but, no problem. No problem. I can pretend to hug something here.
There we go.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And of course, what they're alluding to with the eclectic there is, I have this catchphrase, the future is eclectic, right? Where a little bit background, because some of your listeners may not be aware, but in the automotive industry and trucking and a lot of the propulsion and power industry, there's this big move to electrify everything, right? And while I certainly support electrification, I don't think it's the right answer for every problem everywhere in the world, right? So I think this one thing that I do is sort of my hobby is I promote this technology neutral approach to these things, which is the eclectic approach. So where it makes sense, electrify. Where it makes sense, maybe do hybrids. Where it makes sense, maybe you're doing conventional stuff, but with like biofuels. And so you put all this stuff together, and if you really want to, we talk a lot about decarbonization these days. If you really want to decarbonize transportation and other industry, there's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet, right? So that's where the eclectic, just a little bit of background. What that means, though, is if you're a company and you embrace that approach, you have to now be able to do lots of different things with your CFD, for example, right? You need to be able to handle engines with lots of different fuels. So, people say, well, isn't engine research kind of dying down and stuff like that? I like to say, well, actually, it's probably one of the most exciting times to be in engine research, because now all of these new fuels have opened up, right? We're not just looking at conventional fossil fuel based fuels. We're looking at biofuels. We're looking at e-fuels. We're looking at hydrogen. We're looking at ammonia. And there are challenges in a CFD code. It seems like, if you can do one fuel, you can do them all. Well, that's actually not the case. And maybe the simplest fuel you would expect, hydrogen, is actually has a lot of its own challenges in modeling. And so there's a lot of new work to be done there. Not only at the research level, like at universities, national labs, but also in companies, and also for us. Like we have to come up with a tool now that doesn't just do conventional fuels. It has to be able to approach attack all of these fuels, and not only one of them at a time, but blends of them, right? And there's a lot of challenge there. A lot of it comes down to the chemistry. So can you handle an ammonia methanol hydrogen blend with maybe a diesel pilot or something? I'm just making that up, right? Yeah. That's not easy. And the way you do the chemistry to do the combustion modeling can be very complicated and very hard to get right. And so we focused a lot of effort through the Computational Chemistry Consortium, which I direct that as well. And we have people from around the world kind of working on creating these better mechanisms that are eventually open to the world, right? It's not something we're looking to profit off of. We think we have the best CFD code to make use of them. So we're fine giving them away to the world. Yeah. Use them in whatever tool you want. We hope you use them in Converge, and our customers will have access to them. So a lot of the work's being done on the chemistry, not only on the engine side, but on the battery side. So we talk about electrification. One of the big challenges our customers have is on thermal runaway. And how do you make batteries safer so that you don't end up having battery fires and things like that? Now, those are pretty rare events, but you don't want them happening ever. Not even once, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting because people say, well, you guys have combustion expertise, batteries, whatever. I'm like, actually, the fact that we have combustion expertise allows us to do batteries better than anyone, because now we can handle that problem. And so we put in things like electrolyte chemistry, dimethyl carbonate, ethylene carbonate, things like this into our mechanisms to be able to, and there's still work to be done in this area, but we're able to do the thermal runaway problem really, really well with the chemistry, with the adaptive mesh refinement and everything else that we offer. Electric motor cooling is a big thing you have to be able to attack. And so there you have multi-phase flow often, right? You're injecting oil, say, or something like that. That's a complicated problem, rotating boundaries and things like this. Fuel cells is another big area of interest. We have sort of a partial fuel cell solution now. What we're looking forward to in our next release, version 5, not to get salesy or anything, which comes out next year, it will have a more complete fuel cell solution. So all of these things. So we like to say, I like to say the future is eclectic. Well, then our CFD code better help support that vision. Yeah. Right. And it does. And we work every day hard. We have teams of people here that are working hard, and we collaborate with a lot of outside people as well. We have a lot of really successful collaborations with things like national labs and research centers and universities. You can't do it alone. So through these collaborations, we're able to make big leaps. But the biggest challenge of all of this, so we can have all of the perfect models in place.
Yeah.
Right. Nothing's perfect, but even if you did, it's runtime. We say speed is the new accuracy. And I don't know where that originated from, but we say that around Convergent Science because it's funny, because sometimes our customers just want it to run fast. And like, does it need to be a perfect answer? No. It just needs to kind of give, oh, does the oil go over there or over there? Does it splash that way or that way? Like multi-phase flow simulations can be very expensive if you're actually trying to really get the accuracy correct with the interface tracking and everything. So runtime, so walking that line between speed and accuracy is really, one of the biggest challenges. We think about it every day, all day long, right? In one way or another. So that's probably the biggest challenge with any of these applications. And certainly if you're trying to do this eclectic approach and you're trying to look at all these different technologies in parallel, that's expensive to try to develop these things in parallel. You really need efficient and fast CFD solutions.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answered the question more or less.
Yeah. I mean, computational chemistry is huge, and it's really, enabling a tool that I feel like that was a great explanation that allows people to do that. And then even the challenges too, right? That it's not going to be easy because there are so many directions and shapes this could take. So
exactly.
Maybe we can kind of touch on this part too. I think we touched on it briefly, maybe implicitly earlier, but one of the questions was I would like to learn about the decision-making process for implementing new features in the software. Specifically, what criteria are used and how long does it typically take to consider a new method for industrial applications?
That's a great question. And I alluded to version 5 earlier, and it's something that is happening right now. It's like, okay, what is going in version 5? And you can't put everything, although we want to put everything in the next version, we would never release it then, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the most challenging things we probably do, is figuring out what's going in the next release or even the next 2 releases, prioritizing, and what will that allow us to do tomorrow that we can't do today, right? So we get a lot of feedback. A lot of that is customer driven. So we're constantly, we like to say we partner with our customers. We're not just a support engineer, waiting for them to call us up and asking which turbulence model to run or whatever. We really partner with our customers, right? So we go along that journey as much as they let us. Sometimes we can't because of confidential information or whatever. But we go down that journey with them, and we really walk that with them. And so we're constantly getting feedback from our customers. It'd be really cool if you guys had this, or it'd be really cool. Sometimes that's just like different output, or maybe something in the user interface that could be streamlined a little better. Sometimes it's a whole new model or a whole new approach to something. So definitely when we look at what's going into new releases, and this is part of being the incumbent and never feeling completely safe. You want to make sure, even with your current customers, if you're giving them the most value you can give with CFD. For some of these bigger companies, it's more people in that company using it, which oftentimes means more capability in doing a problem that we couldn't do tomorrow, right? And so now different groups are using it for totally different things, and that's the best way to kind of stay in a company from a CFD standpoint. So a lot of this is customer driven. I don't want to kind of diminish that at all. But the other side of that coin is, there's this famous quote, not to sound cliche, but there's this famous quote from Henry Ford. And maybe you know what I'm going to say, but if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? So on the one side, you have what the customer is asking for. The customer saying, I need a faster horse. I need a faster horse. We have to weigh that against, we're going to give you a car, right? When we gave the market autonomous meshing, they weren't necessarily asking for that. What they were asking us for is, can you make these Kiva meshes faster? It's like, yes, we'll do that, but at the same time, we're going to give you autonomous meshing. And so things like autonomous meshing, the way we do our detailed chemistry for combustion modeling, the way we do our spray modeling, grid convergent spray modeling with Lagrangian approaches, nobody ever thought that was even possible. These are the cars versus the faster horses. So we need to balance those, because those are going to be the big innovations, right? We need to kind of weigh, like, what does the customer need tomorrow versus what are they going to want 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And so that's a delicate balance. And again, we have to prioritize smartly. We can't do everything. We have insanely talented people at Convergent Science. Our developers and our engineers are insanely talented, and they do a lot, but they can't do everything, right? So prioritizing new features is actually one of the most important things we do. And sometimes timing is everything, right? If we don't get something into version 5 and now another company comes around, they may sell to a company that we didn't have a chance to sell to. And sometimes, again, being the incumbent, it's hard to displace, right? We may come around in version 6 and say we can do that now. Well, we've been
Yeah.
using this other tool, we got a whole workflow. So
Yeah.
timing can be everything. And so it's a really, if anything keeps me up at night, and I don't, this doesn't keep me up at night, but if anything were to keep me up at night, it's this. I
Hmm.
stress about,
Hmm.
are we prioritizing things correctly, and what
Right
should go in the
things.
next version, and
Yeah.
and what applications are we going to be able to solve? Because it's one thing to put a cool new feature in the code. At the end of the day, is that really going to mean we can solve a new application? Does that open up a new market for our sales team to go after? These
Yeah.
are all really important questions and things we talk about, debate about, and struggle with. I think every company struggles with this stuff, and that's not a bad thing. Something you have to
Yeah.
work through. But yeah, that's a big part of what we do. So
Yeah.
that's a great question. One I think about all the time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for expounding on it. And I love the aspect too, because right, you hear listen to the customer, but I
Yeah,
love the side of there's paradigm changes, and
yeah,
that's part of what makes CFD so exciting to me. Like we talk, I think I was told at one point in grad school, like all the cool fluids research has been done, and it was the most depressing thing to hear. And
yeah,
now I get out and have these conversations, and I'm like, no, that was the most negative,
yeah.
jaded perspective. Like there is so much to be excited
Yeah,
about
for sure.
that. So that's just exciting to hear that, and to kind of shape the role of, if you're going to be a leader in industry and claim to be leading a code, right, you've got to have that mindset. That's like
Yeah,
essential.
yeah,
Of we're pushing the boundaries, we're going to listen and respect our customers. And I love how you use that word partner, that we're gonna have a relationship here, but at the same time we want to push the envelope, and
yeah,
have some stuff driven too. So excellent.
exactly.
We've kind of touched on this one too, but there was another comment of just well, I'll come back to that later, because I think that flows with a later discussion. Sorry.
Okay,
Just looking at my notes here, and there's a
sure.
fly in here. Sorry, for listeners, for the fly it's distracting me a
Special
little
guest.
bit. Yeah, special guest of honor. Too bad. So one that I have, a lot of my hobby has been helping engineers get hired, and looking for work. And so one of the things I'd really like your perspective. You've hired a lot of engineers,
Hmm.
and you've participated in that, and you know what it takes. You've been, as you've evolved in your company. I know you've worn lots of hats, right?
Yeah,
From developer early on, consultant, sales. You've done a huge swath of the gamut, if not
yeah,
the whole gamut. So,
yeah.
what skills do you think are becoming more valuable to you as a company, and why? And a little bit more context here. I feel like with the advent of a lot of cultural drivers of, I sense this in myself too, that I have to push back against it. That this generation that's coming up grew up with being able to find things fast and everything being quick. And these timelines are not necessarily quick.
Hmm.
And so there's a patience that just is required, I sense, that is lacking. And I'll be the first to say I am not patient at all.
I'm not either.
And so, but I feel like it's part of it's something that's not talked about a lot. And so I'd just be curious your perspective on patience specifically as a skill that's needed, but some other top skills that are becoming more valuable to you as a company.
Well, let's start with the patience because you brought that up, and I think that's not the one that would maybe instantly come to mind, but now that you say it, that's a really good one because yeah, this is a patient. You have to be patient. Things take time when you're developing new software. Um, I like to say like if you haven't put any bugs in your code, then you haven't written any code. You know what I mean? Like there's going
Yep.
to be bugs. It's a process. It's
Yeah.
maybe the easy part almost, not that it's easy, but the easy part is writing it. And then the hard part is finding all the bugs, doing the
Mm-hmm.
verification and validation, documenting it. We have a great documentation team here. But
Mm-hmm.
still the developers need to work with the documentation team and kind of pass the knowledge so that they can write something up. And so those are the things that as a developer, it's like, that's not that fun. I just want to write code. And then that's the cool part. So having patience that, this stuff isn't going to be done overnight. Um, Sometimes we try things that we eventually have to abandon, like we talked about with our struggle early on with how we were treating the boundaries.
Yeah.
That happens today. That happens all the time now, not to that level.
Sure.
But you try something new, it just doesn't always work. Or sometimes you have to just keep going at it and try lots of new things and throw new problems at it. And so there is definitely a patience. If you want instant gratification, then CFD is probably not your thing. Right. And so that's a really good one. The other one, and it kind of goes along with that, these, I hate to say soft skills, but I'm going to say soft skills, versus engineering knowledge. Of course, having a good background in the fundamentals is needed. Having a background in CFD is helpful. We have people that come in here though that they don't really have a big background in CFD, but they're really sharp people and they pick things up. And it's like you got to be able to find those people. You don't want to rule them out in an interview because you might be losing like a hidden gem there. And we have several examples of that in our company. But also just these soft skills, like honestly, it sounds cliche, but work well with others, right? I mean, there's a lot of collaboration that goes on in convergent science and companies like ours. A lot of times the really big ideas come from the hallway discussions or we just had this big meeting in a conference room and then the chatter kind of after the meeting or whatever. And, that's important. It's important to be able to work well with others and not cause a lot of drama, right? To me, it's like, that's almost more important than how smart are you, because you just need one person that has this negative kind of mindset or whatever, and it can bring the whole team down, right? Yeah. You want the people like you were talking about, saying like all of CFD has been done already. You don't want that person in the team, right? No. If you can avoid it. No. But if your innovation really stems from collaboration, which I think ours does more and more every day, you really need that sort of team positive kind of mindset. Not everything's going to work. We're going to lose sales, right? We don't win. I'm not going to pretend like we win every sale we go after. We don't. You have to be able to, again, have the patience to know that we'll get there, right? We'll get there. Mm-hmm. And so I like to say, talking about sales, is everybody at some level, everybody in our company is a salesperson, right? They're not out there knocking on doors and cold calling and whatever. We have a great sales team. Their job is to actually officially do sales. But we do something that I know some of our competitors don't do. If you're a customer and you want to talk to one of our developers about something, you can, right? We give you access to our developers. If that's the best person to talk to about your problem, I mean, you'll start with your support engineers, sure. But if it turns out that that's the best person to talk to about your problem, then let's set up a meeting and do it, right? And that now that developer who maybe isn't used to being customer facing as much is, right? So so in that sense, they're kind of a salesperson or at least a representative of the company at that point. Yeah. And look for areas where our code may be useful that maybe hasn't been uncovered before, even if you're a developer or a support engineer. So having those communication skills are really important. From a technical standpoint, I mean, I guess if I didn't drop a bunch of buzzwords, maybe your listeners will get mad at me. But obviously things like GPUs. All right, GPUs, we can flash that across the screen. GPUs are big. Everybody's talking about GPUs. So having some of that background is important, and we are putting a lot of effort into our GPU solver, by the way. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, the old adage, you won't be replaced by artificial intelligence, but you'll be replaced by an engineer who knows how to use artificial intelligence, right? And so, I'm not one of these guys that think CFD is going to get replaced by artificial intelligence. And sometimes I cringe when I see people running these AI models and saying, hey, look how well you trained it, you're running it within the domain that you trained it. So, okay, I'm not that impressed that I got it right. Okay, so, but things like AI and machine learning can be extremely valuable in a lot of ways, right? I think on the pre and the post processing side of things, and we're creating our own little Copilot right now to kind of help walk you through, installation issues and stuff like that. Because people, whether we like it or not, you could have a manual that people love, is beautifully written, has every detail you'd ever need to know in there, but people don't want to do that. They want to talk to somebody or just ask a question to ChatGPT or something like that, right? And so, there are a lot of areas like that where I think it's really useful. So my point is having some of that background that's a skill that, everybody is looking for these days, is just having some
Yeah.
knowledge of sort of how those techniques work. And that's not to say that machine learning and AI can't be helpful in CFD and model development. I mean, I have seen examples, and we're collaborating on some examples of where models are being improved
Mm-hmm.
because of artificial intelligence, machine learning, maybe on DNS data or something like that. But yeah, I don't think it's going to take over, but I do think that's a skill that's useful to have, because we're just going to see more and more of that being used every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
One last thing I will say,
Yeah.
and this may be the most important one: being a closer. Okay, that's a skill. Being a closer, and it sort of alludes to what I mentioned earlier. It's fun writing the code. It's not fun debugging. Well, it can be fun, right? You're tracking a bug for a while. It's like, oh wow, I got the bug. There can be some fun to it, but it's not really that fun. Running validation cases, documenting, but really at the end of the day, unless all of those steps are taken, the customer is not going to benefit from the original code you wrote, not to the full capacity, or maybe not at all. And so, being a closer, seeing something all the way through to the end, not just getting excited about one part of it, but like seeing it all the way through to the end, I think is a critical skill. And that does kind of jive with your patience comment as well. I mean, that's related.
Mm-hmm.
Not that instant gratification of just doing the fun part. But yeah, being a closer is really important, and it's been really big part of our success is being able to close projects out and successfully.
Yeah. I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this aspect, because I think one of the things that I personally struggle with from time to time, and I feel like others do as well, is knowing, there's even books written on this, like Seth Godin's The Dip, of knowing when to quit.
Yeah.
And there's probably no good answer, but I just would like to draw attention to maybe what are some questions you ask yourself to help distinguish between, okay, it's a lost cause, sunk cost, whatever, and we're going to drop it, versus closing in the persistence aspect. Do you have any frameworks or things that you kind of use to help filter which one is this? Is this a drop it? And I know these questions are so tough because I like to talk about them, but unless you have a specific example, it's really hard to generalize because it depends.
Yeah.
There's so much nuance, so it's probably a silly question.
Well, no,
ask,
it's not silly at all, and it's something that we're faced with all the time, right? Where we have periodic staff meetings with our different teams. Every Tuesday, our entire Tuesday, Keith, Eric, and I is spent meeting with at least a couple of our internal teams, and then we kind of rotate that. We're talking to people all the time throughout the week and stuff, but like that's a dedicated, different teams come in and they present kind of what they've been working on, and sometimes they come in and they say, yeah, put this in, works great, whatever, okay, great. At that point, closing would mean take it to the finish line, help take it to the finish line, because it's not just about the developer. There's a lot of other people at play here, documentation and everything. Yeah. But take it all the way to the end or help see it all the way to the end so that it actually comes out in the next version or whatever, right? That's in that sense, that's closing. But what you're talking about is, yeah, you're working on a technique or a new model or boundary treatment or something, going back to the example earlier. It's like, how long do you hold on to it versus, okay, that just isn't going to work. And that there is no secret sauce to that. At least, well, if there is, I'd like to hear. Maybe one of the listeners has some.
Send it in.
A lot of it is, for some problems, there are canonical cases you can give it. And it's like, okay, if it doesn't pass those cases, yeah, there's a chance there's a bug and that's why, or it wasn't implemented correctly. But, we have to have trust in our developers that they did it the right way. Sometimes we'll offer suggestions like, go back and try that. Maybe there's an issue with this term or something like that. And then sometimes they go back and do that, and that was the problem. Sometimes it wasn't. And then it's like, okay, if it doesn't pass these canonical cases, maybe it's time to like let it go, right? That's a really hard question to answer. And if you get a general answer to that, I'll be the first in line to buy that book.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thanks for fleshing it out a little more, because I think it's always nice to hear. Anyway, it's always nice to hear some relevant perspectives of how it's done. So, with your benefit of, I'm guessing maybe nearly 30 years in the CFD world.
Depends on how you define it.
Okay, we'll start with FEA when you started computation.
Yeah.
What trends do you feel like we're seeing? And I know it's kind of been embedded throughout this discussion,
Yeah.
but specifically devoting some time to trends, headwinds, tailwinds, and where do you see what things get you excited about where we're headed? Like specifically, I know you kind of touched on GPU and machine learning aspects, but
Yeah. Yeah, and those are maybe some obvious ones, right? So
yeah,
I'll throw those out again. I mean, more and more use of AI, um, again, pre and post processing and automating tasks and things like that. I think that's where maybe it's most useful today. Of
yeah,
course, we need to keep exploring other uses of it as well. And just I just want to throw this out too: design optimization, where
hmm.
you have a design space you're trying to cover, and it's a little bit daunting to think I've got to run CFD uh, simulations to cover this whole design space to find an optimum or something. We do a lot of work with genetic algorithms. I did my PhD was largely based on genetic algorithms, and that helps you cover a big design space, but that's still very expensive. So another way to do that, right, is to do like a DOE, a design of experiments, and then fit a surrogate model using machine learning and then optimize that, right? So that's another. I meant to mention that earlier. That's another area where this idea of machine learning can really benefit CFD. It's not replacing CFD. It's just helping you get to an optimum faster. Um, the other trends, I mean, multi-physics is ever. I mean, it used to be, oh, you can do combustion, awesome, right? Now it's, you can do combustion. Can you do that with CHT, FSI, whatever? Throw in your favorite feature, right? With multi-phase actually including VOF and this and that. And so everything is moving toward multi-physics and going back to the eclectic question that you had. Again, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of that is multi-physics. And so again, back when we got started, right? It was okay to be really good at just one thing. Now people want to do more and more, and part of that's because computer hardware has gotten faster, cheaper. We can run more things now, and we want to solve bigger and better problems. The other piece of that is, back in the day when I first started doing CFD, it was mainly used to answer the why question. Okay, why when I ran my experiment did I get this result? Well, I don't have the opportunity in my experiment to kind of pick at every point in space at every point in time, right? That's something CFD allows me to do. So it was like explaining why you saw certain phenomena happening in an experiment. That was like the main usage of CFD. Then as time went on, it's like, okay, we're going to use experiments and computations hand in hand, right? And they're going to kind of take that journey together to hopefully come up with a better design or maybe a new design. Now we're seeing more and more of something called analysis-led design. There are other names for it, but that's a term that we throw around. Analysis-led design, where they don't want to cut any metal until the CFD has told them what to do, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
now you have to be able to do things like conjugate heat transfer routinely and things like that, because it could be all about your boundary temperatures.
Yeah.
Everything needs to be more accurate in order for that to work, which again goes back to the speed accuracy dilemma, because our customers also need everything done overnight, right? They want to be able to submit a job at 5 o'clock, go home, and then at 8 a.m. come in the morning. Oh, my job's done. Let's analyze everything and spend the day trying to figure out where to go next,
Yeah.
right? Well, that's at odds with accuracy sometimes, but that's where things like maybe GPUs, our code, and I could tell a whole story about we rewrote our code completely about 5-6 years ago, from the ground up, all the data structures and everything to be massively parallel. Because when we first started writing our code back in 2001, 2002, the only CFD we had experience with was serial going into that time.
Yeah.
And not to say there wasn't parallel stuff being done out there, there was, but like for us, it
Sure.
was like, wow, if somebody could run an engine simulation on 16 cores, that'd be like revolutionary. Or 32 cores, that'd be awesome, right?
Yeah.
Well, and we got to that point, but you make decisions when that's your goal versus like we need to be able to run on thousands and thousands of cores, right? So, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't know the exact time frame, is when Converge 3.0 came out.
Okay.
That was like a completely rewritten from the ground up version of Converge, massively parallel. So parallelization, and GPUs and CPU parallelization and all of that, that's been a big thing because they want a perfect answer now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so the other thing that's interesting that I found is as things get faster, as compute hardware gets faster, and as things are more parallel, you think, well, they're just going to get their result they're going to do their project in a shorter amount of time. What I actually see, though, is the project expands to fill whatever sort of time is acceptable, right? So that just means bigger simulations, maybe more machine learning, DOE type optimization or genetic algorithm optimization, sensitivity analysis, things like that. So we are making things faster and faster and faster, but it's not like our customers are like, I'm going to run on a coarse mesh, a RAN simulation, a single engine cycle, and just run that one case. And now I'm done in like 30 minutes or whatever. No, they're like, well, now I'm running LES and I'm running detailed chemistry and I'm running fine resolution and I want to optimize everything. And so it's sort of the project is now, and that's a good thing, right? Because that just means we can do much better, more accurate CFD simulations, and they really can inform designs much better. So I guess those are sort of the trends I've seen. I don't know if you want to go deeper on any one of those, but that's kind of where I've seen things go.
Yeah, those are great. I think it kind of touches back on one of the other questions I wanted to come back to.
Yeah.
How industry has evolved over the years with CFD needs. And I think that really summarizes that question as well, that when it started, it was compute limited, right? It was primarily compute limited, and algorithm and probably other developmental models limited, right? But now we're reaching the point where, because compute is easier, just as you said, people can derive more value from simulation because you can put more and couple more, and you can use it to make more decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that really sums it up. Thank you so much for joining today, and maybe we'll just make this an annual thing. Get a check-in and
my pleasure.
Have you on again. So
I really enjoyed talking to you, Kate.
Discuss. Yeah, thank you for joining.
And thanks for doing this podcast, by the way. I think it's very useful for the community. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Really, thank you. Did something about this episode stand out to you? If so, please go ahead and share it with others on LinkedIn or other social media so they can find this as well. See you next time.